All right, so to move us into the next part of our unit, to start wrapping up this chapter, we're going to look at the cell membrane specifically and how things kind of move in or out of the cell. To start with, we're going to look specifically at the cell membrane because we need to understand the structure of it to understand how things can move through it and how it helps to protect the cell. So remember, the job of the cell membrane is to regulate what can either enter or leave the cell and to help support and protect the cell. All cells, prokaryotic, eukaryotic, plant, animal, fungus, whatever, all cells have a cell membrane. And just so you guys are aware, another term for this is plasma membrane. So if you hear me use either term, cell membrane or plasma membrane, they're referring to the same thing. The first and most important thing to talk about with the cell membrane is something that is called a phospholipid. And now, I've mentioned these before when we talked about biomolecules. Phospholipids, they are the main part of the cell membrane. They're the main piece of it. What it is it is a type of fat that has, instead of three tails, it only has two tails, but it has this phosphate head that gives it certain properties that let it align in the proper way. The phospholipids, in order to make the membrane, they form what is called a bilayer. So what a bilayer is it's simply a two-layer membrane, and they orient themselves so that the heads are facing either outside of the cell or the inside of the cell, with the tails kind of oriented together towards the inside of the membrane, towards each other. This orientation is what gives the cell membrane its properties. It's what lets it do what it needs to do. So to actually talk about the structure of the cell membrane, first, as I just mentioned, the membrane is organized into a bilayer, or two layers of phospholipids. There's a few other things that are in it as well, such as various types of proteins that let it do certain jobs, cholesterol, and sugars that, give it other properties. And they orient into what is called a fluid mosaic model. It gets its name because it resembles a mosaic, much like the pirate that is out in the front of the school. A mosaic, if you don't know, is a piece of art that is made from glass or clay pieces that are set into some kind of binder. It gets its name because the cell membrane is made up of various proteins, cholesterols, sugars, other things that are either floating on top of or floating in the membrane. And it gives it this look, much like the pirate out in the lobby, of with all the little glass pieces are the proteins, with the concrete or whatever the binder is being the phospholipids. They just kind of float and do what they need to do. And the other part of that word, or the other part of that term, fluid, the proteins and the other materials, they're not locked. They're not bound in place. There are some things that are holding them in a general location, but they're free to kind of float and move around the membrane. It's not a complete solid, but it's also not a liquid either. There's enough fluidity to it to allow dynamic motion, able for proteins and whatever to move around as needed. So that's the structure. Moving on to properties. And there is one main property that makes the membrane special. And this property is what we call selective permeability. The cell membrane is selectively permeable. So first is this word permeable. For those of you that don't know what it means, all permeable means is that something can pass through it. So like a colander that you'd strain water through pasta or whatever. That is permeable. That allows for the water to pass through. Something being selectively permeable, though, means that some things can pass through it, but not all. And once again, because of the properties, especially because of those phospholipids, not everything can pass through. So this diagram kind of gives a good example. The red molecules can move through the membrane perfectly fine, but for whatever reason, the blue molecules are getting stopped on the outside. That's how the cell membrane works. Certain things can pass directly through it, no problem. Other things are stopped. It is selectively permeable. And the two main things that it stops is the molecules can't be too large, so they have to be small enough to be able to fit in between the phospholipids, or they are charged. They are electrically charged, which is a property that we tend to get to more in chemistry. It's not hugely important right now. If it does come up, we will talk about it a little more in depth, but we really don't need to know the actual properties of being charged. Anything that can't pass directly through the membrane, it has to come in another way. So, for instance, sugars. Sugars are too big to pass directly through the membrane. So they tend to come through what is called a channel. So a type of protein that is essentially like a hallway or a doorway that lets things through. Or for things that happen to be really, really large, like for instance, one of our immune system cells eats infections, so to speak. It will eat like bacteria and get rid of it. Those things will be engulfed by the membrane, where the membrane kind of wraps around it to form a vesicle that then becomes this bubble that it drags into the cell. Lastly is the actual jobs of the different parts. So like I said, the membrane has a few parts to it. In fact, there are four main parts that I'm going to mention. First is the phospholipids, which we've already talked about. Their job is to make up the bulk of the membrane and to give it the selective permeability that makes it special. Proteins, cholesterol, and carbohydrates. So like I said, phospholipids are the main part of the cell membrane, and they are what give it the selective permeability. And on this diagram to the right, those are all shown there in that orangish red. They're the two-headed. They're the headed with the two tails. Tails set inside. Yada yada yada. Next is proteins, and proteins we're going to talk a little bit more about in the next set of notes, because proteins, and it's kind of hard to sum this up really concisely. Proteins have a variety of jobs. Too many for me to list here, even just for the membrane, let alone everything they do, because that's what they do, is they do things. So the proteins are colored blue, and I have a set of them circled in red. And we have two types. We have what are called integral proteins, which are proteins that go all the way through the cell membrane. These act as sensors or those channels I mentioned. And like I said, we'll go more into these later. And we have peripheral proteins, which we're not going to go so much into peripheral proteins. Just know that these ones are the ones that are attached either partly through the cell membrane and are either inside the cell or outside the cell. And they have a variety of other important jobs. It's just we don't have time to go into all of them. Next are the carbohydrates, which I have highlighted here in green. The carbohydrates have a relatively simple job. They act as signposts that identify a cell. And these identifiers can be for several different things. The best example I have, though, is what we know as blood type. Blood type, that A, B, O, positive, negative, those are the identifiers for your red blood cells. And they identify those cells as being a part of your body. That's essentially what these carbohydrates do, is they act as identifiers, whether it's for a type of cell, whether it's for one of your cells, whatever it needs to do. Lastly is cholesterol, and cholesterol I have highlighted here in yellow. Cholesterol kind of integrates itself into the membrane, and it gives the cell membrane a little bit more strength, a little bit more rigidity. So without this cholesterol, the membrane would actually be much more liquidy, which we don't want. So these pieces of cholesterol will help to give it a little bit more strength. So that's where I'm going to wrap up this first video. There's only going to be one question attached to this, which will be popping up here in just a moment. Be on the lookout for the next one to come out. And I will talk to you guys when I see you.